My name is Christina Walsh. I am here to talk about public outreach as it relates to the Department of Toxic Substances Control and the Santa Susana Field Laboratory as the cleanup project specifically that I have been involved with. So you've seen one side of me. Who am I? I started cleanuprocketdyne.org in 2001. At that time, there was no cleanup plan. There was an EA and a finding of no significant impact and really nothing of promise, except for a lot of angry people and a lot of, in fact, back in the day, the people on the panel wouldn't even face the audience. They would have their backs to the audience from the first row. So some things have changed and some things haven't. I also, if you recall, Chris Rowe mentioned the Acme Museum as one of the resources for public outreach. Well, that was something that I created with Bill Bowling. We built a museum for environmental advocacy where the idea was that you would sit around this table. The base of the table was literally 60-gallon drums. And there were maps all around the table. Underneath the glass, so there was no disputing the facts. So the idea was that it would be about solutions. So that was the theme of that museum. But to be clear, both Ms. Rowe and Mr. Luker both vowed to never set foot inside, just on the basis of they're not on our side. In fact, it was the meeting where I called a truce. Where I asked that people would leave their swords at the door. I invited both sides, and because I invited Ms. Rowe, the Mr. Hirsch team went to war on me. So that's something that has been ongoing in this community, this war zone feeling. There is no neutral place. And that, in my view, is the role of the regulator, to be that neutral voice, that center. I facilitated, as a result of the vacuum, first the Rocketdyne Information Society, and then later the SSFL CAG, long before it was approved. In fact, I petitioned several times, but we'll get into that. The petitions I pursued with DTSC were because DTSC sold this idea to me. It wasn't that I dreamed up the idea of a CAG to go against Mr. Hirsch. That was not the case. In fact, DTSC had stopped supporting the work group. They had stopped supporting the PPG that they created. They just basically pretended it never happened, which seems to be the most common theme in all. And it was indeed several people from DTSC, including Mr. Riley, who personally telephoned me when he was the director of the project, asking me to petition for a CAG because that would enable us to get our quote-unquote questions answered. So that was the idea. If we would have a community group that DTSC was accountable to, then DTSC would be required to answer some of these questions. Now, another thing that I was involved with is I worked basically from start to finish with EPA and their contractors for the ARRA, the American Resource and Recovery Act, I believe it's called, Reinvestment and Recovery Act, where a radiation survey was completed. It was finalized in 2012, but it was actually done in 2009, and that was to the tune of $41.5 million taxpayer dollars. This here is the letter from EPA thanking me for my contributions, which indeed were significant. In fact, Mr. Dempsey, who's now, he's passed away, but he said that I saved the state $50,000 in my first weekend of work because I did the legwork. I made the maps because at the time Google Earth was new. Now it seems ridiculous that I would say it that way, but at that time, nobody else was really using it in the way that I was. So I was making real maps that had topography involved where we could actually see the details, which up until then, in all the documents that we would receive from DTSC, there was always a lacking of context, a flat map with no buildings on it. Where is the city? What do these dots mean? Nothing was ever described in a way that would be easily understandable to the layperson. And that's why I got involved in 2001. Now let's fast forward. At the time, my son was 4. And he was in kinder kicks in karate. And that's where I saw my first flyer and got me to a meeting to find out more about the partial meltdown that had happened just 2 miles from my house. So let's take a look at what cleanuprocketdyne.org was, and for a very long time. And my purpose was to provide balanced, accurate information and solutions, because if we aren't looking at the problem, we cannot find solutions. But unfortunately, the meetings that are held by DTSC, they send out notices for the EIS scoping meeting for building 4024. They don't mention the words contamination or cleanup or harmful or radiation or where it is. Nothing like that. Nothing to indicate to the average person, the average resident that isn't deeply involved in this, that they should be, or that it would be related to them. In fact, holding all the meetings in Simi Valley seemed contradictory when the front gate comes out toward West Hills. Now, you all think you know it all because you came here and listened to one meeting, but that is not the case. The history here is long and deep and complicated. So let's take a look at it. So cleanuprocketdyne.org, I've had this website for a very long time where I have worked to provide explanations and in-depth look at what the documents mean, because usually when they publish their back and forth between Boeing and DTSC, they're often published in the format of 5,000-page reports that don't make a lot of sense to the layperson. There is no summary. There is no effort to make it understandable to anyone else. And often the files are so large that you can't even open them. You just sit there and you don't know if it's working. You don't know what's happening. So the average person is not going to be able to dig deep. So on my website, and you can take a look at this because it's there now. It's been there all of this time. But all of these links lead to these blog posts all about specific areas about the site, because the site is complicated. It's owned by 2 different federal entities, and then one of the largest companies in the world, the Boeing company. And the subcontractors are folks like SAIC, CDM. These are the people that ran all 23 Iraqi ministries during Desert Storm. Okay, so we need to take seriously who we are dealing with. And then you have Joe Public, who's sitting there in a meeting. And this is not designed to be understood. So I participated in every single one of these group investigative reports, and I commented on them in depth, and I published that information so in an effort to assist my fellow community members who would otherwise not be able to see all of that. I've taken over 10,000 photographs of the site and published arguably thousands of pages. Area by area, there are different problems in different areas. But providing balanced, accurate information is very difficult when you have hecklers, just people who spend all their time writing letters about other community members. That should not be the purpose of a public meeting, to counter-comment everyone else in the room. The purpose of a public meeting is for the regulator, in this case, this oversight panel, to actually hear from the public and what their concerns are. So when it is allowed that the public be divided into 2 teams, kind of like kickball when you're in 2nd grade, and you're either on one team or the other. And if you do anything that doesn't support your team, you're vilified. Then you're the enemy. So instead of trying to help us get information about the questions we have about contamination that is confirmed to be up at that site, we are attacked by other community members who argue about the definition of the word meltdown, or what radiation means, or what naturally occurring means, or whether we should be afraid of dioxin. I vote yes. We should worry about these things. And by the way, on this page, you see that pile of debris with barrels. Those barrels are yellow. Yellow is an indicator of radioactive waste. That's how it was stored at the site. But this isn't Area 4 where the radiation stuff is supposed to be. This is in Area 1 at the bowl. This is a pile at the bowl. And at the time, I did not understand what I was looking at. I wrote a book. I included that photograph, and I still did not understand what I was looking at when I saw those yellow barrels in Area 1. So we have argued about the direction of the wind in 1959 because there are folks who say that if they can prove which way the wind was blowing in 1959, as you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, then we can solve it. We can prove it wasn't us. But you see, the communities that live around the site actually live all around the site. So there isn't a correct direction of wind. However, there were instructions inside of the site that directed them to release, burn release. That's how they got rid of a lot of their waste. Only when the wind was going to the south-southwest and at least 3 miles an hour, because they didn't want it to fall back down on them. Now, the people of Oak Park were less lucky. Now, the lower image, the black and white on the lower left, that's all barrels and debris and just contaminated garbage, just as far as the eye could see. That's how they treated the site. So now, to have these people vilified because they're speaking out about why the site still isn't cleaned up. Remember, my son was 4 when I got involved. He is now 19, 6'6", and going to college. So the idea, since we're still waiting for the cleanup to begin, that this has somehow been responsive or we should somehow be more patient is ridiculous. It truly is. So let's take a look. So area by area, looking at where the contamination is. This is based on the maps that were provided by DTSC. Trying to provide context to where we live is very important. And when we see warnings about radiation in areas that aren't supposed to have radiation, it's of great concern, especially when we are told over and over and over again over the course of years, that there is no radiation to be seen. And therefore, the investigation, this $41 million investigation that was done, was restricted to Area 4 and the northern buffer zones. By the way, the northern buffer zones were created because that was contaminated and it was owned by the Brandeis people. So in a lawsuit, there was a land exchange and that became the buffer zone, and therefore it didn't get off site again. That is how we have been treated. Now that was contamination that was going down to a children's camp. And now Mr. Hirsch has chosen to vilify the children's camp instead of the people that are doing the polluting. So maybe you're smarter than I am, but that I find difficult. So these burn pit historical photographs are something also that you should keep in mind when you think about what this means. This is where they shot barrels, watched them burn, and this was a way of, they would call it test to destruction. And that's how they would get rid of waste, save a truck or two, or thousands, I don't know. Balanced information, area by area. What is there? What are we seeing? When we saw actual pipes, discharge pipes that were just going down into the environment without thought about what that impact would be, especially given the faults, the lines that they've shown us on their own maps, we need to have these questions answered. But instead, DTSC routinely goes into what they call shelter in place. It's a very familiar term on site as well. It means don't go anywhere when the bad stuff is outside. Wait till it passes. And that is essentially how the community has been treated. And instead of answering our questions, they shelter in place and wait until we go away. And unfortunately for me, I've been one of the people that has continued despite these efforts. And so some of these questions have gone unanswered for years at a time. And then I come to find out that the presentation that they told us about the groundwater treatment system was actually not turned on during all of those years that they were doing these poster shows about how wonderful it was and how many millions it cost. So it seems to me that the idea of actually protecting the surrounding public and the environment has fallen way down on the list. And that is one of the reasons for the frustration that you hear, both in my voice and that of both sides that you have heard from. Balanced, accurate information and solutions. So SB 990, when SB 990 went down, it went down because of the federal supremacy issue, okay? So it wasn't possible for the state of California to order the federal government to do something. And so that is why Boeing stood in the shoes of the Department of Energy and claimed harm. If you look at that lawsuit, that is exactly how it was framed. In fact, the court even questioned how exactly Boeing would be harmed, since they were a paid contractor by the federal government, reimbursed, so they only made more money for more cleanup. In fact, that's how they bought the site. That is documented in newspaper articles at the time in 1996, where they bought it to get the cleanup contract for something like $123 million, which is somewhat laughable now. But never mind, the point is still the point, and it is documented, and it can be checked out. So SB 990 goes down, and Dan makes a deal with Cal EPA, with Linda Adams, and they organize this AOC to background, cleanup to background. It was a settlement in order to skip several steps that would save years and millions of dollars, which is somewhat funny considering that was in 2010 and now we're in 2016 and it still has not started. So again, when you talk about, oh, we aren't even allowed to finish our presentation that we were promised, when we've been waiting this many years for simple questions to be answered, like why doesn't the rain ever fall where the water monitoring station is, where 90% of the water is supposed to be flowing off the site? Why does it never rain there when it rains everywhere else? That's something that I still cannot get answers to. And that goes back to 2000 and I believe 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So it becomes very frustrating. So one of the things when I had Acme and when we said, this is the museum, when we worked with EPA and we agreed to be basically the starting point every day of that RAD survey and background study. And the purpose was that we went around this, we were part of this committee. Every day we were part of the process. We were living and breathing witnesses to the process that was arguably one of the most comprehensive RAD surveys ever done by EPA. They went national and went on tour to talk about the accomplishments in this RAD survey. So we went every step of the way. We went out there to look at what background looked like. We needed to find undisturbed soil within the same geologic formations. It needed to be limited to the Chatsworth and Santa Susana formations in order for the radiation and how it would behave within the soil configuration, how that would work. So we were part of that, both on the chemical side and the RAD side, every step of the way. Dan was there too. EPA was there. This is, by the way, we found fossilized, just incredible formations when we were out in the field. And all of these are links. They're all on the website because I felt that it was important when taxpayers are spending this kind of money to find out the truth finally, it needs to be made available to the people that have concerns, the people who live here. So balanced, accurate information and solutions, area by area, issue by issue, as they came up. What was the old conservation yard? What was the new conservation yard? How were these areas handled when they dug out a reactor core? In many cases, they threw the stuff back in. So it's pretty important to understand where these places are. A magnetometer was used. Several other, they even used mules and walked every inch of, not every inch, but I would say arguably probably 90% of the walkable surface of Area 4 was hand walked. I know the mules. So that all was done so that the surrounding public would be able to finally, after decades of theory, finally have answers. So the question is, after all of this work, why is it that now in 2016, this $41 million radiation survey is nowhere to be found? The background study is very difficult. It's just, it does nothing to explain the process, the purpose, or how it was done and why. How is it normally done? Why is this different? And how do we move forward? Those should be the questions that the regulator should be answering and leading from the center. Providing something independent, area by area. These outfalls matter to us because they lead to where we live. We live a mile below the site. Everybody does. It's on the top of the hill. And then we know what happens with gravity. So let's take a look at how this was handled. So what about the independence of this? And is this really oversight? Okay, so to me, it would seem that we have a problem when the statutory obligation that is shown in Chapter 6.8 of the Health and Safety Code. Let's take a look at what number it is. I have it on the next few slides. But the issue here is, why did DTSC intentionally remove it from the internet? Well, I can show you the emails on my end of when that happened. Exactly when that happened, because we needed that guidebook in order to maintain a fair public outreach process. But instead, DTSC removed it from the internet, because then the CAG would not be accountable to anyone. In fact, it says the only thing that they're required to do is help them set it up, and then they're free to do anything. So they're able to show a website and just undermine the cleanup, and then do so with the authority of DTSC. Why are they not accountable if DTSC is accountable? Well, apparently they're not. So that's the primary problem here. So this question was asked: why is this authority not being taken seriously? Here, when Mr. Rolfes actually asked this question, the answer he was given was that it wasn't consistent with the Health and Safety Code, and that is not true. That is blatantly untrue. So when we look at Health and Safety Code 6, Chapter 6.8, and then it's 25358.7.1 in the Superfund section B, where it very specifically shows that particular language in order to maintain diverse reflection of the surrounding affected communities. So DTSC's refusal to do so is to basically create groups, and this is by design of DTSC because we didn't make it up. It didn't exist except for that DTSC created it in order to adhere to the Health and Safety Code. So why would you create a group that doesn't have to follow any rules? It just seems unfathomable. But that is how corruption of government happens. And this is at its core. You are looking at it. So if you choose to not see it, then that That is the problem, and that is why I've been freaking out about this. This is very important. 25358.7.1. And it says specifically to reflect the composition of the affected community and the diversity of interests of the community by including all of the following types of individuals on the community advisory group. And in fact, with so many people that have been pushed out, why is it so we need to think about the purpose of this. We need to think about why there's a requirement of diversity. Because otherwise, if you think about the process for DTSC, the way they sold it to me was this was something where DTSC was accountable to answer the questions of the CAG. And that's why if you create a CAG, that's what Norman Riley said to me. That's what the local person related to Dayton Canyon, who also sold it to me, was Susan Callery, another public participation person of the past who used to listen to us before the shutdown, shelter-in-place theme of the most recent directors that have led the agency. The reason this matters is the whole purpose is to protect the interest of the surrounding affected community. The purpose of a CAG, the purpose of DTSC's regulation and oversight of this cleanup is not to protect the interests of Boeing, not to protect the interests of the polluter. It is for the purpose of protecting the interests of the environment and the surrounding affected public. That has failed because every step of the way, DTSC is protecting the polluter. And this is shown very clearly here because this allows DTSC to basically stand in the room and let the CAG do the lying for them. And that is what they have done. They have used inappropriate tools, such as making videos to try to vilify other people in the community, demanding that cancer victims be brought forward and inspected by them to scrutinize whether their cancer was real enough. And this is, by the way, is all from, Alec, Abe. They've all had different cancers as well. So for them, it might be a personal issue, trying to tell themselves that it wasn't related to their work at the site. But that is not our problem. As a surrounding affected community, the agency, DTSC, is supposed to be looking out for us, providing a mechanism so that we can ask our questions, get our questions answered, not by other people. If I ask a question about a meltdown, I'm not asking Chris Rowe. So it should not be allowed that she and others should shoot me down because I have questions. I've been declared invisible because I chose to call the discharger of contamination the polluter. I believe that's fair. So these are issues that need to be acknowledged. We need to follow the purpose of what a CAG is supposed to be. And DTSC has refused to help or participate, even though in the Health and Safety Code, in the handbook, in the guidebook, it all says that you're supposed to. But every step of the way, DTSC refused. Now, there was a counter petition from Dan and his team that included Ms. Duffield. They actually had me taken out. In fact, when these actions happened from the top, the actions that took place were to remove any opposition. That is not the role of DTSC. You're supposed to protect us so that our voices in this process can continue. That is the point. We need to be able to have an unbiased, balanced program where we can get our questions answered, not where we have to sign up on one team or another. But instead, DTSC has provided a culture and a community where there are two camps. You are either with the work group or you're with the CAG deniers. And there's nothing in between. It is either the worst thing that ever happened, 240 times worse than 3 Mile Island, some might say, or that you could fill the Rose Bowl 55 times over with the soil that needs to be removed because it's contaminated. Pick your comparison. But the point is, we have been left with an alt-left and an alt-right, and DTSC has failed to provide a center. And that is what we need. This should not be a partisan issue. This should not be divisive. It should not be using fear-mongering in order to make people afraid of the cleanup. This result has basically a huge disservice to our communities who have waited for responsible cleanup now for decades. I've been waiting since 2001. Others have been waiting much longer. And so every time when we wait another decade, another year of inaction, our positions get more solidified, where it really doesn't matter what the center says, especially when they say nothing. Nothing. So let's talk about that Chatsworth meeting. You know, there was a long lead up to that. In that same room, I was once invited to a meeting with the director Debbie Raphael. I thought she was going to ask me about my in-depth knowledge about the site because there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of community misunderstanding. But when I got there, and Chris Rowe can actually attest to this because I believe it happened to her as well, she told me to lay off Dan Hirsch. That was what the meeting was about. That was the head of DTSC telling me to back off of Dan Hirsch, who I never speak to. She said, you released his taxes. And by the way, that is not the case. Mary Weisbrock released his taxes. I just looked at them. I didn't even share them. But I was reprimanded. I was also summoned in on a different time on behalf of Linda Parks and Dan Hirsch, Marie Mason. They all had me meet them in this same room where they told me I had become a detriment to the cleanup and therefore I was to not show up at an emergency ordinance hearing that Linda Parks was having to try to stop the ISRA, the interim source removal action that was being done by the Regional Water Board. So I supported that because I thought an interim action was needed because things were just flowing down the creek to a children's camp below. I thought it was very important that we begin to address those drainages and do so right away. That is also where the PPG meetings happened, and then they stopped happening like it never happened. That is where we did the first background meetings when it came to the science as far as how to adhere to MARSIM. So all of those things happened in that same room. And then years later, it's as if none of it happened. $41 million later, it didn't happen. So why does it matter? Well, we cannot have a credible future without a cleanup that we can believe in. It's just as simple as that. If we are the poster child of cleanup failure, we don't win as a community. We never get a future. It might be beneficial to the Dan Hirsches of the world. It might be beneficial to those who are suing and have money in the game. It might be so. But for DTSC, the goal should not be to hold this up as a nuclear failure. That should not be your goal to this community. You owe us better than that. And we don't. We know that the polluter pays for DTSC headcount on this project. In fact, I remember that deal. I was in Senator Kuehl's office with that meeting when they paraded Mr. Riley around to us. You're gonna have one guy in charge. You're gonna know who's in charge. It's gonna be reliable and accountable. That was all crap. DTSC's solution, change the face. When things got thick, change the face. Get rid of the face. Give them a new face who then says, I just got here. I'm going to need time. And so, of course, then another 18 months goes by, and then we get another face. And that is how this has been handled. Richard was in charge. He had been removed for a year before anyone at DTSC told anyone in the public that a completely different person was responsible for the project. According to the 2007 order, the cleanup order, the consent order, they are supposed to notify the public. They are supposed to notify you. We are supposed to know. David Dassler had been gone for 6 months from Boeing, and people were saying Paul Costa is now signing in someone else's name. It doesn't matter, because no one is accountable. That is what DTSC's job was, and DTSC has not done their job. Now let's look at the independence of the IRP, and this is really important. Okay, it allowed the director to avoid controversy, because first it was Eric who was the administrator. That was the email address on the website that was given to the public in order to submit questions, concerns, issues that they felt needed to be addressed. So instead of it going to this independent source as defined by the legislation, it went to Eric, who was sitting in the director's office as her new executive assistant. So that was not independent. And now what? Chris Law has also been hired into DTSC in some other capacity. So that is not independent. When we are treated like this, that is not independent, and the results are long lasting. And honestly, whoever lasts is who writes the story. I have 600 pages of cleanup to the political standard. It's been edited twice by Mr. Riley, but there are still parts of it that I can barely get through, so it's not ready for publishing. But someday, because the rewrite of history that has been taking place has really been to the detriment of the surrounding communities. The representation of diverse views is important because that allows for trust to be built instead of removed. If nobody can trust the answers, if you just say everything's rigged, we don't get anywhere. And when it is allowed that they provide secret funding to the CAG and they use all of their funding to undermine the cleanup, not one single meeting in the last 3 years has been held for the purpose of hearing about the concerns that people have about contamination. That is what the cleanup action is. That is what this is supposed to be about. And yet no accountability has taken place. None. Instead, you removed the rules. So this rewrite of history is very dangerous, because that means that we're gonna go back to theories. So here we have 40, it's not 40 million, it's actually $41.5 million that this little 8-volume set cost. And it's nowhere. Why is it nowhere? Now, interestingly, I can fit it on 2 DVDs, and actually there's no good reason in the world why it isn't on the internet. Why is it not on the internet? Instead, they're allowed to go back to theories. That way Dan can go on about his extreme scary version, continue to fundraise on that. And denial then seems justified. We did not, that seems fair when the extreme fringe edge is the only voice anyone hears. And then we have Nuclear Secrets by NBC, this 5-part series that is only one-sided. Again, it only makes for division, and division is not your role as a regulator. We need a community advisory group that represents the community, not one that works to defend the polluter. To defend or protect the interest of the people. Who is going to do that? Now, if we look at the CAG website, everything on the CAG website, everything is about denial, including the false map that was provided by DTSC. So this map shows 8 different routes for trucks to leave the site. The meeting when they called it the transportation meeting. They packed a high school gymnasium. Hundreds of people showed up. Hundreds of people don't show up ever. Like 8 people plus contractors. That's usually the mix. But in this case, hundreds of people showed up because they were being told that millions of trucks every minute for the next 10 years. We're going to go through our parks, our open space, our protected areas. It was ridiculous. In fact, even on this map was a railroad that had not been there for more than a decade. Like, it is a dedicated orange line now. So the fact that they're using such outdated and indeed false information to base the potential routes off the site is really disappointing. Even more disappointing, and this was confirmed by Mr. Leclerc, that DTSC would happily spend 10, maybe 20, as he put it, $1 million studying the idea of a conveyor belt. A conveyor belt that would require going across private property that has already been under litigation and is a children's camp. So the idea that you're going to put a conveyor belt of toxic, contaminated waste over a children's camp where they've already sued and had, signed all those papers years ago. I don't know how. This is just ridiculous. But this is a way, again, to push it forward until none of us are left. And that way people who have never heard of this can be in charge of the solution. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to let the real information go so a new story can be created, because the stuff is still up there. So let's go a little further into the CAG denial. On their website, this little video with the truck that shows that the one route, Woolsey Canyon, that is real is too steep and scary for trucks to go down, even though they've gone up and down for 50 years with all sorts of nuclear materials. That wasn't up to us, but yet now when it's supposed to be cleaned up, we're supposed to be afraid of the trucks. This is a misuse of these resources. The CAG is supposed to represent us. Instead, they've gone town to town, 5 different communities, to pass resolutions to stop the scary cleanup because it's been fraudulently mischaracterized, one would say, I guess. So why does this matter? Because if anybody goes against, this was the AOC, so everybody was very confused when the AOC happened. They wondered how, what did this mean? First of all, it isn't a cleanup format, cleaned up to background to a bright line that anybody understands or does on any large scale, because it isn't done on any large scale. You always use risk. But to mischaracterize risk and to do shows, Groundwater U, and shows that essentially are saying that cancer-causing things don't cause cancer. Over here, it doesn't cause any cancer here. Everywhere else it causes cancer, but here at Santa Susana it does not. In fact, Mr. Luker even attested that nobody in Box Canyon has cancer. So they have like this cancer-free zone, and that's very nice. I'm thrilled for them. But it's not accurate, it's not fair. It's not fair to vilify people when they come to meetings wondering, why are my body parts being removed? And what is happening up here when I keep hearing about this? Those are legitimate questions. Those people should not be victimized and vilified because they have those questions. They should not be scrutinized to say that they need to prove their epidemiology of essentially their disease. That is not the purpose of this type of oversight. You're supposed to be protecting the public. They are the public. Now let's see how this happened before. When it came to the attention of Secretary Adams that I had questioned the AOC, she ordered them to basically handle me. There's another email where she directs, this says, I want to make clear that I am not going to take this kind of criticism, let this kind of criticism happen again. This is from Linda Adams to Dan Hirsch. And then they had a coordinated plan with Mr. Craven, Mr. Hirsch, and Secretary Adams in order to talk about how to handle Ms. Walsh. Here's the email that they're referring to. were being hit by the Boeing fans. I have never been a Boeing fan, and she knows that. But this is how they chose to characterize anyone who wasn't for revenge. This should not be revenge. Every truck that comes down from that hill should not be a winning point for Dan. And every truck that comes down the hill should not be a losing point for the CAG. It should be the right amount. In Swedish we say lagom, just right. It should be designed to remove what needs to be removed in order to be safe, but to minimize that action as much as possible. That's what the AOC says. So if we're going to follow the AOC, I would love to implement it, but we need to implement all of it. It isn't a one-page document or a one-word document that just has background. It is indeed I believe it's a 45-page document that has very detailed exceptions and mandates that we do all possible to minimize the surrounding impacts. So what I'm asking for is that we implement the agreement and not allow the responsible parties to manipulate the public by using this CAG format. If DTSC is unwilling to play its role in responsible community advisory groups, because I've seen it go south from Benicia and onward. I've talked to the person who helped write the legislation, and all of them have been betrayed by DTSC in the conversations I have had, because they have used it as a shield to hide from the public and blame, well, we didn't say that, those people said that. And they just stopped talking. Well, a community advisory group is not supposed to replace DTSC. That is not the purpose. So when we see, and by the way, Maziar Movasagi, he hid under a baseball cap at the work group meeting when these things were announced. When Dan Hirsch made a 10-day warning, a public warning at his work group where he said if he didn't get the changes he wanted to see on an agreement in 10 days, heads would roll. That's what he said. And 10 days later, Mr. Riley's head rolled right out of the project. And that is why I wrote this letter. But instead of hearing our concerns, they refused to have any public process after that. In fact, the PPG, we were not allowed to ask. It was never on the agenda, and we were never allowed to ask questions about this new agreement that made no sense and that didn't follow any of their normal processes. So it was DTSC who created this problem. It was DTSC who created this vilifying, this manipulation of the public. And they did so using this program that they were then unwilling to defend. So CAG content. Let's take a look at what a community advisory group is supposed to do and what their brochure actually does. More harm than good. It's a trifold that has been distributed using funding by the polluter, because that is their only funder, is the Department of Energy, to tell the public that they should be afraid of the cleanup, even though there are all sorts of exceptions that are designed to address those things. So what we should be doing is working to address those exceptions and how to navigate them responsibly so that they can be, again, believed, credible, because that's what we need, credibility. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be even on the list, on the wish list, and that's what is such a disservice to all of us, because that means this story never ends for us. And that's not right. You have the ability to make this right. CAG denial on this brochure, CAG denial on their website, article after article after article is to vilify those who talk about contamination, screaming harpies. That's what they call us. You know, it's really hard to have a civilized conversation when those are the words that are used to describe, or shunning, absolute shunning for years at a time, designed from the top. And by the way, why does the same person head all of the different community groups? All of the committees that are related to this site are all headed by Alec. Whether you're in the West Hills Neighborhood Council, even though he lives in Simi Valley, or whether you're at the CAG, it doesn't matter where you are, ALEC is in charge. It doesn't make any sense. And by the way, ALEC led the counter petition to stop my CAG petition. And he CC'd Mr. Hirsch. He was on his side then, and I think still now. So the CAG was asked to testify on behalf of DTSC at this hearing that was held that essentially created this independent review panel. So why? And in this, they start asking about the funding of other groups, questioning that, and then they categorically also deny receiving any funding from the polluters, even though we now know that that was all a lie, because DOE was secretly funding them the $31,000, which may not sound like much to you all, but it matters because that's what funds the voice of this issue for our local communities. And so it matters what that voice says. From the website, who is going to defend us? Here on their own website, Dr. Zeman categorically denies that they have received any funding from Boeing, NASA, or DOE. We know now that that is absolutely false. And then when you look at the work group, we understand how this all started, because the work group has played very dirty with Consumer Watchdog, Enviro Reporter, and PSR collaborating to slander people. I was investigated for a year by the Senate Office of Oversight and Outcomes. Mr. John Hill was the lead investigator who monitored the CAG blog that I had access to because I created it in order to defend myself. But nothing was ever done to clean my name. That was never done. It was okay that I was slandered in these reports, and then they were reproduced and represented over and over and over. The whole reason that this all sticks is this was a sticky settlement that didn't make a whole lot of sense. It wasn't written by the people that know how to implement a cleanup, so it wasn't written to be implemented. So the AOC was incomplete. And so we need help. We need help with a path forward. We need help in navigating those exceptions. We need help in what replaces the normal parts of this process if you're going to skip over them. How do you defend that later when you have someone who is suing you from the outset to mandate that you don't look at other solutions when later that's going to be the basis for the lawsuit? So you need to do it right now. Without oversight, that is impossible. That is what is supposed to be done by DTSC. Instead, DTSC sits silently while the polluter or the CAG lie to the public. And they're not doing the lying, so they don't feel compelled to correct it, but they're the authority. So they should be compelled to correct it, and they never do. So that is essentially dog whistle antics at its worst. Flat out lying about the funding, that was something that we asked about for several years. And now we come to learn that we were right all along, which means the polluter was engaging in antics in order to undermine the credibility of this cleanup, when they should be working to reassure the community that it would be done right. So we need DTSC to fulfill its purpose, to protect the people and the environment and uphold regulations. The purpose of a CAG is to represent the diverse views and concerns of the affected communities. That should not be limited to 3 guys that have decided nothing happened and are going to go town to town telling the public that all of this is political. That's the political part. That should not be allowed. And it's because it's in the absence of anything else. There is no other voice. When DTSC holds their twice-a-year meetings, I don't know who they're telling, but nobody goes, okay? There's like 30 people maybe? 30 people. 500,000 people live within this site, And yet 30 people show up to those meetings where nothing is said. They usually have them in the format of what I call speed dating, where we are divided into groups and then we get 4 minutes, then we have to move to the next area. And so we're often in the same group with someone who says, what's area 4? Well, where are my questions going to get answered? If we have to go through what area 4 is, ding, that time is up, and then we move to the next area. It is designed to be missed. It is designed to keep the public out. They use words to make sure the public doesn't feel welcome or smart enough. Abe often will say, and he's probably said it to you, that he's the only person qualified in this room to speak about this issue. This is not like a conference of nuclear physicists. This is supposed to be about how do you explain the harm that was caused to the public by this action. This action was this nuclear work. Now, Abe would like you to believe that there isn't any harm in that. But we know otherwise. The evidence shows otherwise. So you need to base your actions based on reality, the millions of pages that show you that cleanup is needed. And we should not be tolerating this show to pretend that nothing is needed in order to counteract a crazy cleanup. If you can't defend it, then you need to say why. So the CAG meetings, in the handbook, it says what provisions exist to ensure CAG meetings are free from harassment and discrimination. Now, what DTSC did instead of following the guidance in this handbook was they deleted the handbook. This is serious. This is very serious. And I know that it is very easy to dismiss me as someone who is too emotional and so maybe shouldn't be regarded as anything to worry about. But when you leave these questions unanswered for decades at a time, it isn't me that you have to worry about. It is the future that you are causing. So when it was removed from the internet, we're being told, and by the way, I asked, this is when it was removed from the internet. When I cited it as a requirement of why DTSC needed to act and participate in their role in this community advisory group. Instead, this is the stuff I got. And I reported things and I was ignored. I reported things and I was ignored more. I was told that there was a grievance process. I was ignored. No one ever responded. So when my rights were violated over and over and over again, nobody responded. So it isn't so strange that what happened. That's just something that I feel I need to say. So this $42 million RAD survey that has vanished from sight, this is a serious misuse of ARRA funds and should be investigated because we want our money back then, because it isn't serving its purpose. That money was essentially, it just made contractors rich, and we were used in the process because we need that information in order for this to move forward. And to hide this study from public view, even though it's redacted already. So there is absolutely no reason for it to not be made available to the public, other than to essentially give payback to Dan, who wants to go back to the good old days where he can talk about millions of or thousands of pounds of plutonium or whatever it is that he wants to scare people with today. And that is not to say that there aren't things to be scared of, to be sure. In this case, like here's an example from the historical site assessment, and this isn't from 1950, this is from 1987. In 1987, a maximum beta level detected in the rooms was 107,954 dPm. 1,000 is the acceptable limit. So So to say that nothing ever got out, and DTSC says that all the time. They have spent millions on shows like Groundwater U and other things to pretend that nothing got out. That is a misuse of funds, and I think needs to be looked into very seriously, because that is not where this money should be focused. Details of contaminants that entered the environment, and yet DTSC doesn't want to say so. They say nothing ever left the property. They make it a buffer zone, and so that way nothing ever left the property. Pages and pages, uranium fires. These are... So, I don't know. It probably doesn't matter. None of this matters. They did a photographic comparison, an aerial comparison, year after year after year, to show where disturbed soil was, where possible mounding, where buried material existed. They just made a mountain. They made a creek. We called it Bigger Than Bill when we found a wall of contamination that was just shoved into the creek. That was the ISEO that I first got involved with. That is how we first got Mr. Riley to look at the site more closely. And that is what led to the 2007 order. But it wasn't good enough. This is not good enough. Pages and pages and pages, and yet these volumes are not available to the public. Instead, angry letters, bullying practices are allowed. Where is the regulator? Where is the radiological study? Where is it? The cohort, this special cohort petition, Form B, this is what was done by Bonnie Clee. That was, but it only applied to Area 4. So you understand, when they each got $50,000 a piece or whatever it was that they got, the other people, the people that worked in Areas 1 and 2 and 3, who were also sick, or even some who worked in Area 4 but not for DOE, they had the wrong they had cancer but not the right kind. So that's where you had real divisions. And then in meetings, these people that are fighting their own cancers, they're sitting there in a meeting, and then they're being called killers by the Dan team. So it isn't so strange that these divisions are so deep, especially in such a divided time. But this is not helping, and it's DTSC's role to not be partisan, and it's time that they start doing their job. So in conclusion, the CAG process as created by DTSC for purposes of adhering to the law as described in Chapter 6.8 of the California Health and Safety Code, that needs to be accountable. If it is to create boards that are unaccountable to anyone, confidence and trust in the process is severely diminished. That is the system that you've designed so far. So you either need to remove this process and be the center, or defend the process and be the center. But either way, DTSC needs to step up, because allowing for two camps, denial and revenge, when neither is true, neither is helpful, and neither is appropriate, neither is productive. We don't get to a solution that makes any sense for the people who actually live here. This should not be about what will be good for some guy in Santa Cruz who's working to change the rules on nuclear safety. I appreciate that, but that is not the role here. For DTSC is to protect us, not to protect him or hide from him and use us as shields or pawns. That is what DTSC has been doing, and that is what needs to stop. They need to hold truth and science accountable, and they need to hold the polluters accountable to that truth and science, instead of just accepting their version, or not even publishing when they disagree. They don't tell us, the public, that they disagree. So it does not enable us to support those situations where we are being snowballed. That doesn't make sense. Oh well. As a result of DTSC's failures to perform these duties as a lead regulating agency, this complicated cleanup that has multiple owners, which includes 2 agencies of the federal government, cannot be managed properly. We cannot get to a solution that anyone can believe in if it's all based on a letter that was received from various politicians demanding that the normal process not be used. Because if you do that, then you ensure that there's going to be a lawsuit on the other end, and we still don't get cleanup. We don't want to be your Flint. We don't want to be your Flint. And there should be no reason for that, except for DTSC's literally criminal inaction. Criminal failure to do their job. That is what is kicking the can down generations here. And we who have invested time in this process, it is impossible for us to pull our heels out of the sand and take in new information when we are treated this way. The deadline is 2017. It was set almost 10 years ago, and we haven't even started. So you think I'm impatient? Well, I have good reason, and I am going to see this through, one way or another. I will be reporting my findings, including all of the recordings. I have hours and hours of recordings of CAG meetings where they vilify, slander, discredit, diminish, disrespect the public, all for the purpose of discounting our concerns, to make it okay that the polluter continue to pollute and we continue to take it in. DTSC has failed, and that's where your job here is to look at that failure and do so clearly. If you choose to ignore that and enable this to continue, then you're just as bad as they are. But there we are.